Welcome to Alter Health, the epigenetic code. This is where we talk about the science of how your life shapes your genes and how your body can change when you change the conditions around it. Real stories, real science, and real answers. Let's go. A few months ago, a woman sat across from me in the Zoom call. I'm going to change the details enough that nobody who knows her could recognize her. But the conversation itself, I'm going to give you almost word for word, because what she said and what I had to say back to her is the entire reason for this episode. She is in her mid-40s, and she was put together in the way successful women are put together, the kind of put together that takes work. She had taken time off from a busy job to hop on the call with me, and she had brought a folder with her. And the folder was thick. Lab results, family medical records, articles she had printed out, and a hand-drawn family tree. She opened her folder and said in a voice that was completely calm, almost businesslike, "I'm going to get breast cancer. My mother had it at 50, my grandmother had it at 45, my great-aunt had it at 52. I have the BRCA1 mutation. I've known since I was 28, and I'm here because I want to be ready when it comes. I'm not interested in false hope. I have read everything. I know what the statistics say, and I want to talk to you about how to prepare my body for what's coming." I want you to imagine that for a moment. This wasn't a woman in panic, and it was not a woman in denial. This was a woman who had spent almost 20 years organizing her entire mental life around the idea that her body had a deadline. She had built her career around that. She had decided not to have children around that, and also had structured her relationships around that. She had, in her own quiet way, made peace with it. And she had come to me not to be talked out of it. She had come to be helped to get ready. I looked at her folder, at the family tree she had drawn so carefully, with the little circles for the women and the squares for the men, and the shaded ones for the ones who had been sick, and I had to make a decision. The polite thing to do, the thing many doctors would do, would have been to nod sympathetically, suggest some general health support, maybe order a few tests and send her on her way with her belief intact. I couldn't do that, because what she believed about her own body was not, strictly speaking, true. It was a version, one version of the truth. It was the version of the truth she had been given by people who didn't have the full picture, and it was about to cost her the rest of her life whether or not she actually got sick. So I said to her very gently, "Can I tell you something that might be hard to hear?" She nodded, and I said, "What you've been told about your gene is half of a sentence. I would like to tell you the other half, because the other half changes everything." This is Alter Health, the medicine nobody told you about. And I'm Dr. Nicola Schmitz, and today I want to talk to you about why your genes are not your destiny. There is a word that almost nobody outside of genetics research uses, and it is one of the most important words in modern medicine. The word is penetrance. Stay with me, because once you understand this word, you cannot unhear it. It will change how you read every news story about a diseased gene. It will change how you talk to your doctor and what you think about your own family history. It's one of those words that should be on a billboard, and instead it is buried in academic papers. Penetrance is the technical term for how often a gene actually does what the gene is supposed to do. Or to say it more precisely, penetrance is the percentage of people who carry a particular gene variant and actually develop the condition associated with it. Now, you might think, well, if you have the gene for a disease, you get the disease. That is what gene for something means, right? That is what we have been taught for decades. The cancer genes cause cancer. The Alzheimer genes cause Alzheimer. The heart disease genes cause heart disease. Cause and effect. Simple. But it is not simple. It's not even close to simple. Almost every gene that has been associated with a disease has a penetrance that is much lower than people think. In some cases, dramatically lower. And the gap between what people think and what is actually true is one of the great quiet tragedies of modern medicine, because that gap is where fear lives, and fear changes lives. Let me give you some numbers, because numbers cut through. Take BRCA1, the famous breast cancer gene that my patient was worried about. If you read a popular article about BRCA1, you will see things like women with this mutation have a very high risk of breast cancer. Some articles will say up to 87% lifetime risk, and they will print that number and they will not explain it. Women see that number and they make decisions. They have preventive surgery. They restructure their lives. They decide not to have children. They live as if the cancer is already growing somewhere in them. And here's what the 87% number actually means, and what almost nobody's told. That number came from studies done in the 90s on a very specific group of families. Families where the cancer was already very common, where multiple generations had been sick, where the families had been selected for genetic studies specifically because they had so much cancer. And when researchers later looked at BRCA1 mutations in the general population, in women who carried the mutation but were not part of those high-risk families, the lifetime risk was significantly lower. Different studies have given different numbers, but most modern estimates for the general BRCA1 population put the lifetime breast cancer risk somewhere between 50 and 70%. Now, that is still a high number, I agree. Nobody's saying it's small, but think about what that means. It means that 30 to 50% of women carrying BRCA1, somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 2, don't get breast cancer in their lifetime. They carry the gene and they have the mutation, but they don't get the disease. And here's where it gets really interesting. For many of the so-called cancer genes that you read about in headlines, the penetrance is much lower than BRCA1. There are dozens of gene variants that are associated with various cancers where the actual penetrance, when measured carefully in the general population, sits below 30%, below 20%, and in some cases below 10%. That means 7, 8, even 9 out of 10 people who carry those variants will never develop the cancer they are supposedly genetically programmed for. They live their whole lives with a gene that, according to popular reporting, should have been their fate. And the gene does nothing. So the question, the real question nobody is asking loud enough is, what is different about those people? What is the player doing in their cells that is different from the player in the cells of the people who get sick? Because if you can answer that question even partially, you have changed what those genes mean. Let me give you another number, APOE4. This is the gene most associated with Alzheimer's disease. If you carry one copy of APOE4, the risk of developing Alzheimer is roughly 2 to 3 times higher than the average person. If you carry 2 copies, the risk is much higher, sometimes quoted as 8 to 12 times. Sounds terrifying. And here's what the numbers also say and what gets quietly buried. Many people with 2 copies of APOE4 live into their 80s and 90s without developing Alzheimer. Many studies of centenarians, so people who live past 100, have found APOE4 carriers among them doing fine, cognitively sharp, walking around without dementia. The gene increases risk, but it does not deliver a sentence. Take another example, this one closer to a lot of women listening. Hashimoto thyroiditis, the autoimmune condition that attacks the thyroid tissue. There are several gene variants strongly associated with it. If you have one of them, and especially if your mother had Hashimoto, you might assume you are destined for the same. The literature doesn't actually support that. Carriers of the most common risk variants have somewhere between a 15 and a 25% chance of ever developing clinical Hashimoto, and most of those who do develop it after some kind of trigger: pregnancy, severe stress, significant inflammation, toxic exposure, a serious viral infection. The gene is the soil. The trigger is the seed. And without the seed, the soil sits there. 3 out of 4 women with the risk gene never get the disease. The pattern is the same wherever you look. The gene gives you a risk. The risk is real, but it's not destiny. Now, you might be wondering, if all of this is true, why has nobody told me? Why did my doctor, when she gave me my genetic test results, not say, by the way, this is a probability, not a sentence? Why did the headlines I read not say 3 out of 10 women with this mutation will never get the disease? There are a few reasons, and I think it's worth being honest about all of them. The first reason is that the standard medical conversation is built around worst-case planning. Doctors, especially in countries with legislation cultures, are trained to give you the highest reasonable risk number, because the cost of underwarning a patient is much higher professionally than the cost of overwarning them. If you tell a patient her risk is 50% and she gets cancer, she will say, "Why didn't you tell me?" If you tell her 70% and she doesn't get cancer, she will not sue you for being too cautious. So the conversation slides toward fear because fear is legally safer. The second reason is time. A doctor with 15 minutes per patient cannot explain penetrance. He cannot walk you through the difference between high-risk family studies and general population studies. And he cannot sit with you while you absorb the difference between a probability and a verdict. So he uses shorthand. And the shorthand sounds like, you have the gene, here's your risk number, here are your screening options. The shorthand sounds simple, but it is also incomplete. And the third reason is more uncomfortable. The medical system, the pharmaceutical system, and the testing industry all have economic interests that lean toward emphasizing risk. A patient who believes he's going to get cancer will get more screenings, more imaging, more interventions, more prescriptions. A patient who understands that the risk is real but modifiable might pursue a quieter path, one that doesn't generate as much revenue. I'm not saying anyone is being dishonest. I'm saying the incentives quietly shape the conversation. And the fourth reason, the one I find the most important, is that most doctors don't know about penetrance variability themselves, not in any deep way. They learned the gene equals disease model in medical school, and most of them have not updated it. The literature has moved. The clinical practice hasn't caught up. So you end up with a situation where the science is one thing, the conversation in the doctor's office is another thing, and the headline you read is a third thing. And you, the patient, are left to navigate the gap between them, usually on your own, usually in fear, and without the information you actually need. Penetrance is the first big idea I want you to take from this episode. The second is just as important, and most people have never heard it explained. Almost no gene does just one thing, and almost no gene acts on its own. We have a habit in popular conversation of talking about the gene for something. The gene for breast cancer, the gene for depression, for height, as if there were one switch in your DNA that produced one outcome in your life. It's a comforting picture, but it's wrong. What actually happens is more like an orchestra. Take the example of height, because it's uncontroversial. We used to think decades ago that height would turn out to be controlled by a small number of genes. As genetic research progressed, we kept looking for those genes. We didn't find them. Instead, we found that height is influenced by thousands of genes, each contributing a tiny amount, all interacting with each other and with the environment, especially with childhood nutrition. There is no gene for height. There's a network. Or take something more medical, depression. People talk about the depression gene, usually meaning one of several variants related to how your body processes serotonin. The truth is that depression involves hundreds of genes interacting with each other, with your stress system, your gut, your immune system, your sleep architecture, and your social environment. A person can carry every supposed risk variant and never become depressed. A person can carry none of them and become severely depressed. The genes are players in a band, not soloists. And then there's something called pleiotropy, which is a fancy word for a simple idea. One gene can do many different things in different parts of the body. The BRCA1 gene I mentioned, the one associated with breast cancer, also does something else entirely. It's involved in DNA repair. It helps your cells fix damage to their DNA when something goes wrong. That is its actual job, day to day. The cancer connection comes from what happens when that repair work fails. So a person with a BRCA1 mutation doesn't have a cancer machine in their body. They have a slightly worse DNA repair crew. Whether or not that worse repair crew leads to cancer depends on how much damage the cells are being asked to repair in the first place, which depends, of course, on what is happening in the rest of the life. This changes the question entirely. Instead of asking, do I have the cancer gene, the better question becomes, how much damage am I asking my repair crew to do, and what can I do to make their job easier? That's a completely different conversation. It's also a conversation that gives you something to do. Whereas the first conversation, the gene equals cancer conversation, gives you nothing to do except wait. I want to give you one more idea before we come back to the woman in the call, because I think this one's going to stay with you. Tell it to someone this week. It's the kind of thing that opens up a different conversation in a family. In the winter of 1944 to 45, the Western Netherlands went through what is now called the Hunger Winter. The Nazi occupation, in retaliation for Dutch resistance, blocked food supplies to the western part of the country, and for about 6 months, the population in cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam survived on rations that, by the end, were below 500 calories per day. Tens of thousands of people died of starvation. pregnant women lived through this. Children were conceived during it, and babies were born to mothers who had been starving. After the war, the Netherlands carefully tracked the long-term health of those babies. The Dutch keep good records. Decades passed. Those babies grew up, and they had their own children. And researchers started noticing something strange. The babies who had been in the womb during the hunger winter, especially those who had been in the womb during the first 3 months of pregnancy, grew up to have higher rates of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and certain mental health conditions than the general Dutch population. That, on its own, you might explain by saying they were undernourished in the womb, the body got the wrong signals about what kind of world it was being born into, so it set itself up to be efficient at storing energy. Sad, but understandable. Here's the part that should make you pause. When those hunger winter babies grew up and had their own children, their children who had never been hungry, who had been born into an abundant post-war Netherlands, also showed elevated rates of those same conditions. The effect crossed a generation. The grandchildren of the hunger winter, the people who had never personally experienced starvation, were still carrying something. What were they carrying? They were not carrying a changed gene. The DNA hadn't been altered. What they were carrying was an epigenetic pattern. The starvation had laid down chemical markers on the DNA of the hunger winter babies. Those markers had said to the body, "You are in a world of scarcity. Set yourself up accordingly." And when the hunger winter babies grew up and made their own children, some of those markers came along with them. Now, if the hunger winter were the only example of this, you could maybe argue it away. It's not the only example. Let me tell you about another one, because the second one comes at the question from a completely different angle and arrives at the same answer. There is a small town in the very north of Sweden called Överkalix. I hope I pronounce it right. It's up near the Arctic Circle. For most of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, the people there lived isolated lives, dependent on local harvests. Some years the harvest was good and there was food in abundance. Some years the harvest failed and there was almost nothing. The Swedes, like the Dutch, kept meticulous records: birth dates, death dates, harvest yields, food prices, all of it recorded in church registers for 200 years. A group of researchers, starting in the late 1990s, took those records and started doing something that nobody had thought to do before. They looked at what people had eaten in childhood, specifically during the years between about 8 and 12, the so-called slow growth period just before puberty. And then they followed what happened decades later to the grandchildren of those people. What they found was extraordinary. If a boy in Överkalix went through a famine year between the ages of 8 and 12, his grandsons, 2 generations later, had longer life expectancies and lower rates of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. If that same boy went through a year of abundant overeating in that same window, his grandsons had higher rates of those diseases and shorter life expectancies. The effect was strong. 6 years of life expectancy difference in some cases. 6 years. Based on what their grandfather ate when he was 10. Let that sit for a second. What your grandfather ate when he was 10 can still be influencing what your body does today. Not as a vague genetic memory, as a measurable difference in disease rates and life expectancy. The Överkalik studies have been challenged and discussed and replicated like all good science, and the basic finding has held. So what we have is 2 completely independent studies in 2 different countries, looking at completely different generations and completely different stressors, arriving at the same conclusion. What happens to your ancestors in critical biological windows can lay down epigenetic patterns that are still echoing in you generations later. You're not just genetically descendant from your great-grandparents, you are biochemically influenced by what they lived through. Now, I don't want this to scare you. I want it to liberate you. Because if patterns can cross generations going downward, they can also be interrupted going forward. The same plasticity that allowed your great-grandmother's hunger or your great-grandfather's abundance to mark yourselves is the plasticity that allows you today to lay down different markers for your own children and grandchildren. The system goes both ways, and that means the work you do now, if you still plan to have children, is not only for you, it also changes what the generations after you will inherit. That's a different kind of motivation than I'm doing this so I don't get sick. That is, I'm doing this because my great-grandchildren will live inside the chemistry I'm setting down today. So let me come back to the woman who sat across from me in the call with her folder and her family tree and her certainty that she was going to die of breast cancer. I told her slowly what I've just told you. I told her about penetrance, about the actual numbers, not the headline numbers. And I told her that her mother and her grandmother had developed cancer in a specific historical and biological context, and that her own context was not the same context, and that this difference matters. I told her about the BRCA1 protein and what it actually does, and how its job of DNA repair depends on what damage is being thrown at it, and that damage is influenced by everything we've already talked about in the first episode of this season: sleep, stress, food, environment, hormonal balance, inflammation. I told her that I was not promising her that she wouldn't get cancer. I don't promise anyone anything in that direction because the body isn't a vending machine. What I told her was that her belief that she would definitely get cancer was statistically not supported by the evidence. She had a higher risk, yes, but she didn't have a verdict. And the difference between those 2 things was, in her case, the difference between living the next 30 years bracing for impact and living the next 30 years actually living. She didn't respond right away. She sat there. I watched her. I've learned to give people time at moments like that, because what's happening is more than information processing. They are rearranging a story they've been telling themselves about their own life, and that takes a minute. Sometimes it takes longer than a minute. Eventually, she said very quietly, "Why has nobody told me this?" I didn't have a good answer. I told her some of what I told you earlier in this episode: the time pressures, the legal incentives, the simple fact that medicine hasn't caught up with the science. She listened, she nodded, and then she said something I will never forget. She said, "I've wasted 20 years. And I had to be careful with her then, because she was right, and she was also wrong. She was right that the story she'd been told had cost her time. I want to tell you what those 20 years actually looked like for her, because the abstract idea of wasted time is not as painful as the specifics. When she was 28, she met a man she loved. They talked about children, and she told him she couldn't have children because of the gene. She didn't want to pass it on, and she didn't want to leave a child without a mother in their teens. He stayed with her for 3 years. But then he wanted children, and she couldn't change her mind, and he left. There was another man after that, briefly. There has not been a serious relationship since. She turned down 2 job opportunities in her 30s that would have required moving abroad because she wanted to stay close to the cancer center where she had her surveillance plan. And she didn't take a sabbatical she had dreamed of because she didn't want to be away from her doctors for that long. She didn't buy a house because she didn't want her parents to inherit a mortgage when she died. And she lived in a rented apartment for 15 years, knowing that any year now she wouldn't need anything bigger. She had a recurring nightmare about her mother's last weeks, except in the nightmare she was the one in the bags. Those are the 20 years she meant, and they were not abstract. They were a series of specific decisions made over and over, all built on a story that turned out to be incomplete. But she was also wrong, in a sense that mattered, because she was assuming that the 20 years were over, and they were not. She was 44. She probably had 40 more years of life ahead of her, possibly more, and the question wasn't what she had wasted, but what she did next. That conversation was about a year ago, and she's still working with me. Her risk profile hasn't changed, because you cannot change the gene. What has changed is the conversation. She's no longer organizing her life around impending death. She's organizing her life around supporting her DNA repair systems, her hormonal balance, and her metabolic health. The risk is still there, but the fear is no longer running the show. And the strange thing is that the practical things she's doing for her body are not particularly dramatic. It's sleep, movement, specific nutrients to support methylation and detoxification, reduction of certain environmental exposures she hadn't thought about, nervous system regulation, almost everything we will talk about in the second half of the season. The interventions aren't exotic. The mindset shift was the dramatic part. Before I close, I want to say one thing very clearly because I don't want this episode to be misunderstood. Understanding that your genes are not your destiny doesn't mean abandoning sensible monitoring. If you have a known genetic risk for something, regular blood work matters. Tracking the relevant markers over time matters. And working with a doctor who knows your situation also matters. Imaging, in the right context, with the right considerations, can be useful, and those decisions should be made carefully with a physician who knows your individual case. What I am pushing back on is the idea that monitoring is the only thing you can do. That is the part that has been wrong. The standard offered to someone with a risk gene has been, we will watch you, and when something appears, we will treat it. That's not nothing, but it's not enough. The other half of the work, the half that actually addresses why the gene might or might not get loud in your particular body, is the heart that has been missing from most conversations. So please hear me. I'm not telling you to ignore your situation. I'm telling you to make it bigger. Monitoring plus understanding plus active support of your body is a completely different stance than passive surveillance and waiting. The first stance gives you agency. The second one gives you only patience. I want to bring this home for you because the woman in my call was just one person. The pattern she was in is everywhere. Maybe you have a family history of something and you have been quietly bracing for it. Heart disease in your father, diabetes on your mother's side, depression that runs through the women in your family, autoimmune disease that has now hit 2 of your sisters, early dementia in your grandparents, whatever it is, I want you to consider that what you have been told about that family history is probably half of a sentence. The risk is real, but it's also responsive. You are not your mother or your grandmother. You share genes with them. You don't share their nutrition, their stress profile, their sleep patterns, and so on. And here's the part that should sit you up. The player can be influenced. That is what this whole season is about. We are going to spend the next 9 weeks going into exactly how. Not in a vague way, in a specific way. For today, I just want to start considering the possibility that the story you have been telling yourself about your genetic future is not the final version. There's a different version, and the science supports it, and you're allowed to consider it. So that is where I want to leave you today, with the word penetrance, with the idea that a gene gives you a probability, not a sentence, with the picture of your ancestors quietly whispering in your cells, and the knowledge that you can change what whispers in your grandchildren's cells. With the woman in my call who had organized her life around a deadline that turned out to be a probability. If you have a family history of something that worries you, I want to invite you to start a different conversation about it, not a denial conversation, but be curious. What actually happened in those generations? What were their lives like? What were the foods, the stresses, the environments? And what is different about yours? Where can you intervene? And to help with that, I've put together a free guide called Family History Mapping. It is in the show notes, completely free to download. It's a structured way to lay out your family medical history and start reading it as information rather than as prophecy. It walks you through the questions to ask, what to record, what to look for. It doesn't replace genetic counseling for serious situations, but it gives you a much better starting point than fear and folklore. Next Tuesday, we go into how your daily life actually enters your cells, the biology of how all the lifestyle decisions you can make their way down to your DNA and change what the player plays. By the end of that episode, you will look at your day differently. And if this episode opens something up for you, don't forget to subscribe and share it with somebody who has been told they are going to get something because their mother had it. There are a lot of those people, and they deserve the full sentence. Thank you for listening, and see you next week, because health is a choice.